In the winter of 1943, the heartland of America held its breath behind fences. Across the plains of Wisconsin, in the thin snow of a continent at war, a field of mud and timber had been reborn as a city of ghosts, Camp McCoy. To the passing farmer it was only another military installation. To those inside it was a geography of surrender. They came by rail, hundreds of them, their uniforms stripped of insignia, their language muffled by the steady rhythm of the train. Japanese prisoners of war, captured in the Aleutians, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, in the drowned silence of Tarawa. The war had sent them eastward, far beyond the ocean they had once called home. At dawn, when the camp loudspeakers crackled to life, the sound of a bugle carried across the frost. It was foreign to them, this disciplined melody of victory. But beneath the sound, a new rhythm began to pulse, faint, unthreatening, almost human. The rhythm of wood meeting leather, baseball. The Americans called it the pastime of peace. But here, surrounded by wire and guard towers, it became a language of survival. Inside the compound, men who had once fought to the death now watched the Americans throw a ball. It spun through air as if unburdened by war, its arc a brief escape from confinement. Some prisoners recognized it. Baseball, Yakyu, had crossed the Pacific long before the soldiers did. Japan had embraced the game, disciplined it, made it its own. Now, behind the wire, it returned like a ghost from another life. By March, the guards had begun to notice. When the day's labor ended, the prisoners gathered in the open yard, shaping bats from scrap lumber, stitching balls from canvas. They marked the bases with chalked stones, tracing the geometry of an American dream inside their cage. For the GIs who watched from the perimeter, curiosity softened suspicion. Baseball, after all, was a neutral language, the only tongue in which both sides could briefly forget the war. At Camp McCoy, a sergeant named Charles Harper kept a notebook of daily routines. His entries, still held in the National Archives, mention the first of these games. March 28, 1944. Japanese prisoners playing baseball again. Good fielders, some natural hitters. Strange to see them laughing. The note sits between lists of rations and weather reports. Mundane evidence that even amid global destruction, men still sought patterns of ordinary life. As the snow melted, the field grew muddy. But every afternoon, after the machinery of war rested, the rhythm of play returned. Gloves passed between hands. Cheers rose, uncertain at first, then freer. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was contact. At the edges of the field, American guards leaned against their rifles, watching. Some joined in. Others bet cigarettes on the outcome. It was there, in that brief spring of 1944, that the idea took hold. A game between the captors and the captured. A match between GIs and Japanese prisoners, staged under the American flag inside a prison of victory. The officers permitted it. Perhaps they thought it would pacify the men, keep morale steady. Perhaps, secretly, they wanted to see whether a game could reveal the measure of an enemy's humanity. The date was set for May. By then, word had spread across the other camps, Lordsburg, Clarinda, Camp Kennedy in Texas. Baseball diamonds appeared wherever the fences left room for breath. In Iowa, prisoners built stands from lumber and invited guards to watch. In New Mexico, a Japanese interpreter wrote home, "We play baseball in the desert. The wind carries the dust, but also our laughter." The war raged on elsewhere. Saipan, Leyte, Okinawa, but behind barbed wire, men rehearsed another rhythm of existence. Each swing of the bat was an act of memory, each catch an assertion of self. They were soldiers no longer. They were men learning again how to live. By early May 1944, the field inside Camp McCoy had hardened beneath the sun. The snow that once blinded the fences was gone, replaced by dust that rose in slow halos around the men at practice. The war outside the wire seemed to pulse in newspaper headlines, but here time contracted into the measured rhythm of a wind-up and a throw. The prisoners had chosen their captain, a former university infielder from Tokyo named Lieutenant Sato. Before capture on Attu, he had played in the Tokyo Big Six League, where the game carried a monk's precision. He still bowed before stepping into the batter's box, even here, where the outfield ended at coils of rusted steel. The Americans watched, amused, uncertain whether it was ritual or challenge. Opposite him, the GIs formed their own squad, drawn from the military police and supply units. They called themselves the Badgers, borrowing the Wisconsin mascot. Their pitcher, Corporal James Murphy, had once played semi-pro ball in Iowa corn towns. In his letters home, he wrote, "We're to play the Japs on Saturday, should be a lark." But on the morning of the game, he cleaned his glove twice and lined the seams with oil. He did not know why he cared so much. The camp commandant approved the match with ceremonial caution. Rifles would remain nearby, guards would ring the field. Yet the air that morning carried a different expectation, something lighter than authority. From barracks and mess tents, men gathered at the perimeter, shading their eyes against the sun. A flag rose over the backstop. The wind cracked it once and then stilled. At noon, the first pitch cut the air. It was a fastball, high and inside. Sato stepped back, the sound of leather snapping echoing against the barracks. A murmur rolled through the spectators. When the next pitch came, a curve over the plate Sato swung. The contact rang clear, a note of perfect symmetry. The ball soared over second, dropped just short of the fence, and the game began. They played 9 innings beneath a sky that seemed wider than war. The prisoners wore stitched uniforms of khaki canvas, the Americans their olive drab. Dust clung to every motion, marking each slide with the same color, erasing rank and origin. By the third inning, laughter broke through the formality. When a Japanese shortstop missed a catch and the runner advanced, the guards shouted half-hearted jeers. The prisoners responded with mock bows. Someone kept score on a crate lid. Children from the nearby town, permitted to watch through the outer fence, cheered for both sides. In the 5th, Murphy found his rhythm. 3 strikeouts in a row. Yet each swing from the opposing side carried grace, a balance learned from years when Japan had worshipped the discipline of the game as much as the empire itself. The Americans felt it, the familiar heartbeat of competition detached from hatred. Sato came to bat again in the 7th. The count was full, 2 outs, runners on base. The sun sat low, turning the wire into lines of fire. Murphy threw his best a low curve meant to deceive. Sato waited a heartbeat, then drove it down the right field line. 2 runs scored before the relay reached home. The crowd, American and Japanese alike, erupted. For the first time since their capture, the prisoners shouted without fear of reprisal. When the final inning ended, the scoreboard chalk on wood showed 6-4. Victory for the prisoners. The GIs clapped their hands, some with reluctant smiles. The commandant nodded once, then turned away, hiding the ghost of approval. That evening the camp quieted early. From the barracks came the faint sound of singing, Japanese folk tunes braided with the low hum of harmonica from the guards' quarters. Somewhere in the dark a ball thudded softly against a mitt again and again, as if refusing to let the day end. Records show the next morning's routine returned unchanged: roll call, work detail, rations. Yet in the notes of Sergeant Harper appears one sentence underlined twice: No trouble today. Spirits improved on both sides. Baseball continues. Across the Pacific, the war worsened. Saipan burning, ships sinking under kamikaze dives, but behind the fences of Wisconsin, men who had faced one another through guns now measured themselves through skill, speed, and grace. Each game became an experiment in dignity. Photographs from Camp McCoy survive. Blurred frames of motion, prisoners mid-swing, guards leaning on rifles that point at the ground. In one, a ball arcs above the fence, disappearing into sunlight. The caption reads simply, Japanese POW baseball game, 1944. For a few hours on those fields, the idea of victory lost its sharpness. The Americans saw not the enemy, but reflection, the same hunger for play, for order, for the brief mercy of forgetting. And the prisoners, in turn, learned that the game could outlast allegiance, that even the symbols of their captors could become instruments of endurance. As summer approached, other camps followed. At Lordsburg, the desert wind carried dust over makeshift diamonds. In Clarinda, the cornfields framed the outfield. American papers mentioned it only once. Prisoners enjoy recreation. But within the wire, it was more than that. It was the rehearsal of peace. In war, humanity hides in the smallest gestures. Sometimes it waits beneath a glove's pocket, inside the curve of a pitch. At Camp McCoy, it found its moment a white ball spinning above the wire, its flight unclaimed by either flag. Summer arrived slowly in 1944. The snow had retreated completely, leaving behind mud that baked into a thin crust under the July sun. At Camp McCoy, the baseball field had become a theater of ritual. Daily practice carried the precision of prayer. Gloves softened in leather oil. Bats smoothed over calluses. The Americans began to recognize the rhythm of the Japanese players, not just skill, but discipline honed from years of tradition. By mid-June, the games were no longer a novelty. They became a fixture of camp life. Roll calls took longer, not because of disobedience, but because everyone lingered, watching a foul ball spin through the air or a daring slide into second base. The prisoners and soldiers began to memorize each other's movements, anticipating swings and throws. The ball, once a simple sphere of leather, became a vessel of silent communication. Word of the games spread quickly. At Camp Clarinda in Iowa, men carved a diamond into the flat fields behind their barracks. Boards, salvaged from crates, marked the bases. A discarded feed sack became the first ball. Japanese prisoners taught each other the American style of hitting, adjusting the swing to the cork-centered balls they had never handled in combat. Guards watched from the fence, sometimes offering advice, sometimes wagering cigarettes on the outcome. In Lordsburg, New Mexico, where the desert wind carved patterns in the sand, baseball became a rebellion of joy against monotony. Japanese captives fashioned mitts from old leather saddles. Bats were shaped from timber scavenged from work crews. Every Saturday, the GIs and the prisoners faced one another in matches that lasted until the sun fell red behind the horizon. For the first time, laughter broke through the monotony of captivity. Inside the barracks, letters were exchanged with subtle secrecy. Prisoners wrote to families back home, describing not only the day's labor, but the thrill of a long fly ball, the sting of a missed catch, the small victories of a stolen base. Some letters survive. Today we played baseball against the Americans. Their pitcher is fast, but I hit a double. I think he respects me now. Despite the levity, the shadow of war never fully lifted. Telegrams from distant theaters arrived with news of losses, battles, and the rising toll on men who had once been comrades in arms. Sometimes, during a lull in a game, someone would glance at the barbed wire, imagining the soldiers beyond the camps, or the comrades they would never see again. Baseball was a temporary reprieve, a fragile bubble that the world outside could not penetrate. The games began to take on forms of ritual. Teams formed patterns, the Americans fielding the infield with disciplined alignment, the Japanese emphasizing timing and fluid motion. The prisoners bowing slightly before stepping up to bat became customary. The Americans, at first puzzled, began to mirror gestures of respect, half in jest, half in acknowledgment of shared humanity. On July 17th, a match at Camp McCoy drew spectators from neighboring camps. Guards, camp officials, and a few curious locals watched as the teams squared off. The game began at noon under a merciless sun. Pitchers sweat-streaked their faces, runners kicked up clouds of dust, and the sound of leather hitting wood echoed across the plains. A fly ball soared toward the outfield, and a Japanese catcher leapt with improbable agility, snaring it above his head. Murmurs rippled through the crowd applause, surprise, admiration. In quiet moments, the men reflected on what this game meant. For the prisoners, it was a rehearsal of normalcy, a fragile claim to a life interrupted. For the GIs, it was a mirror of skill and dignity they had never associated with the enemy. And for the guards, it became a lesson in restraint, patience, and observation. By the end of August, baseball had transformed from pastime to community. The prisoners took it upon themselves to keep score, repair equipment, and even improvise small trophies, wooden plaques, carved from crates, painted with dates and scores. These objects, humble as they were, became symbols of achievement and mutual recognition. Yet the larger world remained unyielding. News from the Pacific Saipan, Guam, Peleliu reminded all that death was not abstract. Each victory on the field was temporary. Each inning completed was a respite, not a guarantee. The men understood the precariousness of their small rituals, and still they played. It is said that the longest game at Camp McCoy stretched for 11 innings. By the end, the sun had dipped low, staining the sky with orange. Hands were blistered, faces streaked with dust, yet the players, both American and Japanese, smiled with a sense of quiet triumph. In that moment, they were not captor and captive, not soldier and enemy. They were athletes in the purest sense, men testing themselves, measuring skill against another, learning that even behind barbed wire, the human spirit endures. This long summer, stretching from spring into the early days of fall, became the heartbeat of life behind the fences. Baseball was more than a game. It was a signal, a message across wires and walls that humanity survives even in captivity, and that the simplest gestures, throwing, catching, running can, contain the vast weight of memory, fear, and hope. Autumn arrived at Camp McCoy like a quiet warning. The grass that had been brown and brittle under the relentless summer sun now crunched beneath boots as frost claimed the edges of the fields. The barbed wire shone cold and metallic. The days grew shorter, the evenings longer. The rhythm of baseball persisted, but the laughter was tinged with an unspoken tension, a collective awareness that time, as it had always done, would not pause for games. By September, the Japanese prisoners had settled into the routines of camp life, their bodies stronger from labor, their skills sharper from months of practice. The GIs, too, had become accustomed to these matches. They respected the discipline, the quiet pride, the subtle artistry of the prisoners' play. Yet the war outside the wire intruded with growing intensity. Newspapers arrived sporadically. Saipan fallen, Leyte beaches drenched in blood, kamikaze pilots striking ships. Each headline reminded them that the larger struggle had not abated, that victory in the field here was fleeting, fragile. The baseball games, once purely recreational, began to take on a tone of ritual closure. Each inning carried weight. Each swing, each throw, became an assertion of life against the ceaseless backdrop of war. The prisoners continued to bow before their at-bats. The Americans returned the gesture, increasingly as instinct rather than amusement. Respect was forged in silence, through the measured cadence of the game itself. At Camp Clarinda, the prisoners began organizing informal leagues. Scoreboards improvised from crates were carefully maintained. Captains rotated. Evenings were spent mending gloves, shaping bats, and sharing quiet advice on pitching techniques. Stories were exchanged between prisoners and guards, tales of homes lost, siblings left behind, fathers never seen again. Baseball became the conduit, the bridge, a neutral space in which grief could coexist with play. Sometimes the shadows lengthened in ways that even baseball could not soften. A letter might arrive detailing a cousin's death, a sibling's illness, or the bombing of a hometown. And yet, in the field, men ran as if to outrun grief itself. The ball, soaring over fences or striking mitts with satisfying crack, became the measure of resilience. One afternoon in late October at Camp McCoy, a light rain fell. The dirt of the field turned to mud. Bases became small islands. Players slipped, laughed, and rose again. The prisoners' leader, Lieutenant Sato, paused mid-inning, observing a young American runner sliding into third. For a brief moment, he imagined another life. Not a prisoner, not a soldier, but a student in Tokyo again, walking past cherry blossoms. The Americans, too, caught glimpses of the men behind the barbed wire as human beings beyond the label of enemy. Corporal Murphy, standing in the outfield, noted in his journal, "I never thought I'd see them smile like this. Strange, but it feels like we're not enemies anymore. For a moment, the war stops." Yet even amid this fragile camaraderie, tensions simmered. Small disputes over rules or scoring occasionally ignited. Old habits of suspicion surfaced, but they were fleeting, dissolved quickly by shared effort and the unspoken understanding that this small world inside the camp was theirs alone, a sanctuary carved from dust, sweat, and leather. Autumn brought the first hint of winter's chill. The games grew shorter. The air bit at exposed skin. But the prisoners and soldiers continued, drawing warmth from motion, from the camaraderie born of months behind the wire. Baseball had become their common language, transcending orders, ranks, and nationalities. Archival photographs capture this season with stark honesty. Blurred figures sliding into bases, the sun low on the horizon, fists raised in victory or frustration, and the omnipresent fences framing each moment. The images, mute and frozen, carry the unspoken poetry of endurance. As November approached, rumors of transfers began to circulate. Prisoners would be moved, the camps reorganized. Some letters spoke of impending release or relocation to labor details outside Wisconsin and Iowa. The men understood that the rhythm of baseball, these shared afternoons of discipline and laughter, might not continue indefinitely. Yet, even with this awareness, they played. Each inning became a quiet defiance against the certainty of change. Each run scored, each ball caught, each stolen base small acts of control in a world governed by forces beyond their grasp. By late November, the final games of the season were played. Frost had begun to stiffen the infield. Mornings were bitter and silent. The prisoners bowed once more before stepping into the batter's box. The Americans responded in kind. The final score mattered less than the act itself. In that moment, the men had transcended the boundaries imposed by war. They were athletes, humans, and survivors. Autumn shadows fell across the camps, but the legacy of those long summer games endured. In every careful swing, every shared laugh, every moment of quiet pride, men had claimed a fragment of life. And though the war would continue to rage, both prisoner and captor had discovered something enduring, that even behind barbed wire, humanity could find a field and a ball on which to thrive. Winter descended quietly in 1944, wrapping Camp McCoy and the other Midwest camps in ice and stillness. The earth hardened, the grass disappeared beneath frost, and the infield became a frozen patchwork of ruts and cracks. The baseball season, once measured by dust and sunlight, now measured its hours by the rhythm of gloves thudding against leather and the muted roll of a ball across the frozen ground. For the Japanese prisoners, winter brought reflection. Many wrote letters home, carefully folded and censored, describing not only work details and rations, but the strange and fleeting joy of the summer games. They recounted the stolen bases, the perfect swings, the laughter shared with men they had once been trained to see as enemies. Baseball had become memory itself, a ledger of human connection that survived even as the snow erased footprints. At Camp Clarinda, the final match of the season was held on December 12th. The field was hard and unforgiving, fingers numbed against the cold, breath rising in small clouds. The Japanese prisoners and the GIs approached the game with a quiet solemnity. This was more than a match. It was a farewell to a chapter, a ritual acknowledgment that the bonds forged under wire and sky might soon be separated. Lieutenant Sato, standing at home plate, took a deep breath. His eyes scanned the American fielders, noting their familiar gestures, their movements now etched into memory. The pitcher, Corporal Murphy, nodded in silent recognition. The first pitch soared, cutting through the sharp winter air. The crack of bat on ball sounded like a bell ringing across the empty yard. Each inning carried weight. The runners slid carefully, aware of the frozen hardness beneath them. Every catch required extra focus. The cold made leather stiff, hands raw. And yet the joy remained. Shouts, cheers, laughter, even in muffled tones, rose above the fields. There were no spectators beyond the barracks and the watchtowers, but the game itself seemed to demand acknowledgment, as if the winter wind were a witness to the final testament of their shared experience. The last inning approached, and no one kept strict count. It no longer mattered who would win. What mattered was the rhythm, the pitch, the swing, the throw, the catch. Sato hit a soft line drive to right field. Murphy chased it, catching it just short of the fence. Both men smiled. A brief nod, a bow, a shared recognition. They had survived. They had played. They had endured. That evening the prisoners gathered inside the barracks. Fires glowed in the stoves, casting flickering light over wooden walls. Gloves were repaired, bats stored carefully, balls set aside. There was no celebration, only quiet contentment. Each man understood that the games had been a refuge, a world apart from the war, and that they had created a space where humanity could assert itself against the machinery of conflict. Elsewhere, at Lordsburg and Camp Kennedy, similar farewells unfolded. The prisoners left behind marks of their passage, scoreboards carefully preserved, lines scraped into the dirt, bats shaped and smoothed, the memory of laughter carried in the echo of boots on hard-packed fields. Even the guards, hardened men of war, felt the absence of those games. The fields would remain empty, the bases untouched, until spring returned, and yet they knew that nothing could erase the lessons learned here. For the men of Camp McCoy, the weeks following the last game were a time of preparation. Transfers were announced. The prisoners packed their sparse belongings. They walked the perimeter of the field one final time, fingers tracing the frost-laced dirt where they had run, caught, and slid. The barbed wire seemed less threatening now, a lattice of memory rather than confinement. When the transports came, the GIs and prisoners exchanged bows, nods, and brief smiles. Few words were spoken. Words were unnecessary. The game had spoken for them. Baseball had carried respect, discipline, and fleeting freedom, and it had done so quietly, without fanfare, without pomp, without violence. The trains carried the prisoners east, west, and south. Some would return home to Japan after months in detention, others would remain for labor duties. All carried within them the memory of a diamond behind barbed wire, the taste of victory and defeat, the rhythm of a game that transcended enmity. Even as winter deepened, the empty fields remained. Faint impressions of bases, the shadow of a ball tossed high, lingered beneath the snow. The stories traveled with the men. Letters, journals, and photographs preserved the memory of those afternoons. In the quietest hours, someone might recall the sound of leather striking wood, the laughter that broke over the fences, and the fleeting triumph of humanity in a world otherwise consumed by war. Baseball had been more than a game. It had been a bridge across difference, a language beyond rank and nationality, a rhythm of life asserting itself against the shadow of death. Behind barbed wire, the prisoners and soldiers had discovered the improbable truth that even in confinement, even in conflict, the human spirit could run, could swing, could leap, and in doing so, survive. Years passed. The war ended, flags lowered, troops redeployed, and the Japanese prisoners returned home, carrying the quiet weight of months behind barbed wire. They brought back stories of survival, of resilience, of an unlikely human connection forged under fences and watchtowers. Baseball had been their constant, a tether to memory when the world seemed unmoored by conflict. In the United States, the fields that had hosted these games fell into silence. Grass grew wild over diamonds once flattened by cleats. Bases rotted, boards splintered, and fences rusted. Yet the memory remained alive in the men who had played there, American and Japanese alike. They recalled not victories or losses, but the feeling of the ball in hand, the thud of leather against leather, the shared laughter that transcended fear. Some returned to Japan carrying trophies, simple wooden plaques, crudely painted but polished with care. Others wrote letters describing the games to children, hoping to transmit the sense of order, respect, and fleeting freedom they had discovered. For the American soldiers, those memories lingered in private journals, tucked away in the folds of letters never sent, photographs never displayed. Historians, decades later, would piece together fragments, official reports, diaries, photographs. They would note dates, scores, and rosters. But the essence, the rhythm, the discipline, the human connection defied documentation. It existed in the spaces between words, in the memory of a crack against a bat, a sliding foot, a bow of respect. The legacy of those games endured quietly. In the fields of Japan, boys and girls would grow up playing baseball in the American style, unaware of the full measure of its history, but inheriting its rhythm. In the United States, soldiers would remember afternoons spent in strange camaraderie with men who were supposed to be enemies. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of history, the frozen fields of Camp McCoy, Clarinda, and Lordsburg held the memory of resilience, dignity, and the improbable mercy of play. The photographs, journals, and letters remain. They tell a story not of war, but of the fragile persistence of humanity. One can almost hear it, the pop of a bat, the thud of a glove, the cheer of a stolen base. These echoes, faint but enduring, carry across decades. They remind us that even behind barbed wire, Even amidst suspicion, fear, and loss, men can find a field, a ball, and a moment of grace. Baseball had been more than sport. It was ritual. It was communion. It was defiance against the cruel geometry of war. And in that defiance, captor and captive, American and Japanese, found themselves united by the simplest, most profound truth. To play is to live, and to live is to remember.